I remember the first time I felt it, a quiet weight pressing against the edges of my day, almost invisible, almost harmless. It wasn't the loud, crashing kind of panic that you'd expect from anxiety, the kind you see on TV where someone clutches their chest or gasps for air. No, this was different. It was a whisper, a soft voice inside my mind that nudged me to choose the easier way, the safer path. At first, I barely noticed it. I told myself I was just being cautious, practical. But slowly, these gentle urgings started to shape my choices in ways I couldn't ignore. There was a meeting I was supposed to attend, a conversation that could open doors. Instead, I found myself making excuses, avoiding calls, delaying emails. I told my friends it was just a busy day, but deep down I knew I was shrinking away. Then came the invitations to new experiences, chances I'd once leapt at without hesitation. Suddenly, I hesitated. Maybe another time, I said. The whisper inside was convincing, pressing me to stay within my small, guarded bubble. I couldn't understand why I was retreating when everything in me yearned to step forward. One evening, as I sat alone, I found myself caught in a loop of questions that had been gathering in the back of my mind for months. Why do I avoid certain situations even when I want to be there? Why do I overthink every move before making it? Why do I choose the familiar over the unknown, even when the unknown excites me? These questions flickered with frustration and confusion. It felt as if something inside was pulling the strings, steering me toward a life that felt narrower, smaller, less me. I realized that this wasn't just about stress or bad days. It was something more insidious, more delicate, and it had a name: anxiety. But not the kind that bursts onto the scene in an explosion. This was the silent kind, the kind that shows up quietly and moves in without notice. It doesn't crash through the doors, it creeps in through the windows, rearranging the furniture of our lives when we're busy looking elsewhere. I could feel it inside me, slowing me down, shrinking my world bit by bit without shouting or demanding. What struck me most was how invisible this quiet anxiety had become. I wasn't lying awake at night, clutching my chest with fear. Instead, I was living a version of myself that I barely recognized. A version that backed away from what I really wanted, convinced by whispers that safety was better than risk. It was as if a shadow had settled over my daily decisions, coloring my choices with hesitation and doubt. I didn't want to admit it, but I was allowing anxiety to shape my life in ways I hadn't agreed to. Looking back, I see all the tiny moments where anxiety tipped the scales. The chances I didn't take, the conversations I avoided, the challenges I backed down from. Each one seemed small on its own, but together they formed a pattern of protection, yes, but also of limitation. It felt like living in a cage with invisible bars, where the locks were my own unspoken fears. I remember a conversation with a friend where I finally voiced some of this. I don't know why I always pick the easy way, I confessed. It's like something inside me is saying no before I even get started. My friend nodded, eyes soft and understanding, but also firm. Maybe it's not about being scared of what's out there, they said. Maybe it's about learning how to see what's inside, what's real fear, and what's just the quiet voice trying to keep you small. That moment stayed with me. It lit a spark of curiosity and resolve amidst the haze I'd been living in. I began to realize that this quiet force wasn't just an enemy. It was a signal that change was needed, not to fight or run away, but to understand, to listen, and to take back my life one small step at a time. As I stand here now, ready to share this journey, I'm inviting you to walk alongside me. Maybe you felt this too, that soft whisper steering your choices, reshaping your world without your consent. Maybe you're wondering if what you call caution is really something else. This story isn't just mine. It's something many of us live with quietly, every day. What if we could uncover those whispers? Could we learn to recognize them, not with judgment, but with clarity? Could we find a way to step beyond the shadows they cast? I believe we can. The path ahead won't be about erasing fear. That wouldn't be honest or real. It will be about seeing it for what it is, understanding its voice, and rediscovering the courage to move forward anyway. So here we are, at the edge of something important. The journey we're about to take is about unspoken struggles, subtle shifts, and the power sleeping in the spaces between our fears. It's about how sometimes the loudest battles are fought in the quietest moments, and how we have it within us to rise from those moments whole, brave, and alive. I'm ready if you are. There was a moment during a quiet Sunday afternoon when I noticed a strange hesitation creeping into my movements. I was planning to call an old friend, someone I hadn't spoken to in months, but my hand wavered above the phone. Instead of dialing, I sat motionless, heart thudding softly, weighed down by a subtle resistance I couldn't immediately identify. As minutes stretched, I realized it wasn't reluctance for any rational reason. No past conflicts or fear of rejection explained my freeze. It was as if an unseen force whispered cautions I hadn't invited. At that point, I understood this was no ordinary hesitation. It was anxiety operating in stealth, bending my will with nearly imperceptible tendrils. Unlike dramatic panic, this gentle manipulation reframed my perception of risk and comfort so subtly that I hardly registered the shift. The more this quiet unease deepened, the more it rewired my patterns. Suddenly, choices that once seemed spontaneous morphed into battlegrounds where safe dominated over possible. One evening, as dusk painted the sky in soft oranges and purples, I sat with my journal and tried to untangle these new constraints. I realized how deeply my mental and emotional landscape had altered, not just decisions, but how I felt about them. There was a persistent layer of tension beneath what looked like calm surface moments. It was as if every decision silently carried a weight that wasn't there before. What struck me profoundly was how much this subtle internal shift affected my body without calling much attention. One afternoon during a routine walk, I noticed my shoulders tightened automatically, breath shallower, pulse quickening before I confronted a minor street crossing with an unfamiliar crowd. Small physiological reactions like these began rewriting the script of my daily existence, turning previously ordinary experiences into exercises in cautious navigation. It dawned on me that anxiety's subtle presence wasn't limited to thoughts. It was rewriting my physical responses, training me to brace for unseen threats. This realization, both stark and humbling, meant the challenge was now embodied as much as it was mental. The more I observed, the clearer it became how anxiety's whisper tangled itself with my intuition, blurring lines where discernment should reign. I once trusted a gut feeling as a compass guiding me safely, but now, those sensations often felt yellow instead of green, warnings not always based on reality, but on shadows of fear. A vivid example came when I contemplated volunteering for a project that sparked excitement and curiosity. Yet, an unspoken hesitance pulled me back, a caution that felt like wisdom on the surface, but underneath simmered a stew of what-ifs and imagined disappointments. It was tricky, because the voice masking itself as prudent counsel was really just protective anxiety in disguise. Distinguishing between genuine insight and fearful hesitation became the next hurdle to overcome. At one point, a close friend helped me see this dynamic more clearly. We sat in a bustling cafe, steam curling from our coffee mugs, and I confessed my frustration at being caught in this invisible web of caution. She simply said, "It's like your mind's installed a security system that's now oversensitive, alarming you for things that aren't threats." Her words resonated because they painted anxiety not as an enemy, but as an overactive guardian whose well-intentioned alarms needed resetting. This metaphor reframed my internal experience in a way that reduced shame and created space for curiosity instead of self-judgment. I began to see that reconnecting with my authentic self meant learning to recalibrate this internal alert system, rather than chasing it away by force. This subtle but comprehensive recalibration also brought to light the paradoxical relationship anxiety cultivates with control. I noticed cravings to micromanage situations, all in an effort to avert discomfort or surprise. Ironically, this desire for control often fueled the very avoidance and restriction I resented. For instance, preparing for a team presentation involved meticulous scripting, double-checking every detail, not because I loved the process, but as a shield against potential mistakes and judgments. However, this over-preparation drained energy and stole spontaneity, leaving me more exhausted and less connected to the moment. The quietly mounting burden of maintaining these internal defenses had become a cycle I wanted to disrupt. Even more revealing was witnessing how anxiety's subtle grip extended into relationships. I realized I guarded my emotions behind carefully constructed walls, avoiding vulnerability to keep potential pain at bay. When an opportunity for honest conversation arose, I often deflected or retreated. This dormant mechanism chipped away at trust and intimacy, leaving me lonelier even as I protected myself from perceived threats. I recall a night when a friend asked gently why I hesitated to share my worries. In that moment, I understood vulnerability had become a threshold I was afraid to cross, not because I doubted my feelings, but because I feared losing safety. Recognizing that this protective posture was limiting my connections marked a painful but essential insight. Now, consider how this applies when you face crossroads demanding courage beyond comfort zones. When options multiply, does an inexplicable shrillness rise in your chest, diagnosing what risks to ignore? Does your spirit retreat slightly, pulling back from doors that feel loosely closed? These subtle internal alarms may feel like prudent caution at first glance, but often they are the silky threads of anxiety weaving invisible fences around your potential. Decoding these sensations, learning to parse genuine signals from deceptive whispers, becomes one of the most crucial skills we cultivate in reclaiming our freedom. Through this emerging clarity, I recognize that these discrete patterns, bodily tension, blurred intuition, over-controlled habits, guarded emotions, were interconnected strokes in a larger portrait painted by silent anxiety. Each imprint provided clues inviting me to explore and unravel the tangled influence governing my choices. Although the work was delicate and demanding, it held promise. By honoring these quiet imprints without surrendering to them, I embarked on the path toward reclaiming agency. The journey was no longer about resisting the shadow, but understanding its textures, learning its language, and moving beyond it with intention. I remember a time when I was invited to speak at a small gathering. Public speaking had always stirred a restless energy beneath my calm exterior, but I convinced myself I could handle it. As the moment approached, an uneasy sensation gnawed at my stomach. My thoughts scattered, and doubts proliferated like shadows chasing the sun. Rather than preparing with the usual enthusiasm, I found excuses to postpone even rehearsing a few lines. That hesitation wasn't from simple nerves. It felt like an undercurrent pulling me away from opportunities that once excited me. At that moment, I recognized how subtle inner tensions can reroute our path without an obvious alarm bell. A few weeks later, during a late-night walk, the stars obscured by clouds, I wrestled with a quiet question. Who am I if I let these unseen limits script my life? The silence around me echoed the silence inside, a hesitance to take risks and a compulsion to stay within invisible boundaries. In the solitude, I started to visualize anxiety not as an adversary, but as a stealthy molder of reality, one that shifts perspectives so gently we rarely question its handiwork. Like a faint river carving canyons over centuries, its force shapes our internal landscape gradually and imperceptibly. The challenge wasn't to confront an enemy head-on, but to notice the slow transformations reshaping who we think we are. During a lunch with a colleague who noticed my withdrawal from new responsibilities, I admitted, "It's like I'm walking on eggshells inside my mind." She remarked thoughtfully that fear often masquerades as prudence, tricking us into believing that avoidance equals preservation. This struck a chord. For a moment, I imagined my inner voice wearing a mask, a cautious guardian who refused to let me walk paths that seemed risky but were essential growth points. Accepting this double-edged nature changed how I viewed these feelings. Not enemies to eradicate, but signals urging me to listen carefully while deciding my own direction. On one afternoon, I found myself staring blankly at a blank screen, tasked with drafting an important proposal. My mind flooded with what-ifs about potential failure or judgment. Each imagined scenario stacked upon the other, creating an elaborate fortress around my will to begin. I realized my hesitation wasn't a lack of capacity. It was the silent tension built by anxiety's careful orchestration. The fortress performed its job, protecting from uncertainty, yet trapped my creativity and confidence inside. When I shared this with my mentor, she suggested reframing fear as a companion on the creative journey, rather than as a gatekeeper barring me from action. That subtle shift in mindset became a lantern in foggy valleys of doubt. Relationships, too, bore the imprints of these quiet influences. I recall a moment when a close friend sought honest conversation, sensing walls I hadn't acknowledged. I hesitated, afraid that revealing vulnerability might invite disappointment or rejection. Yet, as I peeled back layers of reticence, I understood this protective posture was not strength, but armor built from silent anxieties. Opening up became less about exposing weakness and more about reclaiming connection. The exchange unfolded like a delicate dance, where trust grew with each shared word. It taught me that the barriers anxiety raised are often illusions, demanding patience and courage to dismantle. One morning, while preparing for a spontaneous weekend trip, a peculiar reluctance surfaced. Everything was planned, yet a restless undercurrent whispered to reconsider, to remain within familiar comforts. I tuned into that sensation, distinguishing what was genuine intuition and what arose from cautious overprotection. I held the tension in my hand like a living thread, experimenting with choice rather than capitulation. Stepping forward, I embraced uncertainty as part of the adventure, feeling a thrill that had been muted for too long. That trip became a symbol of reclaiming freedom from the quiet chains of restraint. In conversations with others, I began to hear echoes of my own struggles, a chorus of hushed doubts and hidden hesitations shaping lives in parallel ways. Sharing these experiences illuminated a collective landscape where invisible boundaries limit potential, often unnoticed. Recognizing this shared humanity brought comfort and reinforced the importance of speaking openly about the subtle impact anxiety can wield. It reminded me that transformation isn't a solitary battle, but a communal journey toward reclaiming agency and vitality. Reflecting on these moments, I've come to see how the unseen forces shaping our choices often wear a delicate veil, concealing their presence just enough to influence us profoundly. Like a whispering breeze that bends tall grass, it molds our direction with quiet persistence. The task becomes cultivating an inner awareness capable of discerning when these influences serve us and when they subtly confine us. With that distinction, we reclaim the power to choose, not at the mercy of silent steering, but with intention and clarity. As I continue navigating this terrain, I remind myself that true courage isn't born from fearless absence, but from forging ahead when hesitation lingers. Each small action, in spite of invisible constraints, rewires my relationship with fear and doubt. Slowly, the silent architects of limitation lose their grip, replaced by an expanding sense of possibility. Our lives grow beyond the edges anxiety drew without consent, opening pathways toward fuller expression and richer experience. And with every step forward, I invite you to listen closely, embrace your own silent whispers, and choose boldly despite them. One afternoon, as rain drummed steadily against my window pane, I sat stirring my coffee, attempting to summon the energy to reach out about a potential promotion. My thoughts spun a web of possible setbacks. What if I wasn't ready? What if I stumbled during the interview? These uncertainties tangled tightly, and a suffocating insistence to retreat settled over me like a dense fog. I realized my hesitation wasn't born of laziness or a simple lack of interest. It echoed a deeper tension that quietly eroded ambition before it could fully manifest. I felt trapped in a maze with shifting walls erected by a force that drained my drive while whispering caution as compassion. When I later spoke with my sister, who has a gift for piercing through my mental labyrinths, she asked, "What stories do you keep telling yourself about what you deserve?" Her question hit me like a sharp breeze, unraveling embedded narratives that had been silently steering my path away from bold moves. She described anxiety not as an external foe, but as a playwright scripting scenes of limitation, writing dialogue that framed doubt as truth. The more I listened, the more I understood how these internal narratives create a cycle of silencing my own ambitions, shaping decisions under the guise of protection. I began questioning the scripts I followed unconsciously and wondered, what if I rewrote these stories on my terms? During a twilight stroll in the park, dripping with fresh spring scents, I observed how nature handles growth amid challenges. Wildflowers sprouted through cracked sidewalks and resilient trees bent but did not break in gusting winds. These images lingered with me, opening avenues to a new understanding. Anxiety isn't a barricade as much as it is a call to adapt, to learn nuance in movement rather than freeze or flee. Like those battered trees, I could develop flexible strategies, responsive, and dynamic, to navigate my fears instead of allowing them to define my limits. This metaphor sparked a subtle shift, viewing my internal resistance less as a block and more as an adaptive system signaling where to pay attention and adjust. A few nights later, I dreamed of walking across a narrow bridge hanging over dark waters. The planks creaked beneath my cautious steps, and my heart pounded. At the halfway mark, a sudden gust swayed the bridge so violently I wanted to turn back. Instead, I steadied my breath and focused on the next plank, then the next. Recalling this dream, I saw it as a vivid portrait of moving ahead despite unpredictability, of cultivating resilience in the face of trembling confidence. Dreams often reveal truths my waking mind tries to overlook. This one reminded me that endurance isn't about ignoring fear's presence, but moving forward with it close, acknowledging the uncertainty while choosing action. When I shared this dream with my friend Marcus, a counselor who specializes in anxiety, he smiled knowingly. Your mind is showing you that courage isn't a flawless, fearless crossing. It's the persistence to proceed, step after uncertain step, he said. His words resonated, illuminating a new dimension. Courage as a practice, an ongoing rhythm rather than a sudden eruption. This perspective reframed my inner dialogue. Instead of waiting to feel ready or brave enough, I dedicated myself to small moments of progress, trusting that momentum builds through cumulative steps. This approach eased the pressure for perfection, allowing grace to enter where once only judgment had lived. From this standpoint, anxiety's influence on habits became clearer. I realized that avoidance and overthinking are forms of mental inertia, holding me frozen in a loop where fear and safety trade places endlessly. To interrupt this cycle, I experimented with micro-exposures, deliberately engaging with mildly discomforting situations in controlled ways. For instance, I set a goal to contribute one small idea in meetings, even if it felt shaky or uncertain. Those initial sparkles of discomfort often dwindled quickly once I took action, peeling back layers of apprehension that had inflated moments before. What surprised me was the power of these deliberate tiny steps. They rewired my responses not overnight, but steadily, like steady drops carving stone. Another crucial layer surfaced in recognizing how social connections interact with anxiety's hold. I began to see how isolation sometimes acts as a safety net, creating insular zones where fears can echo unchallenged and grow unchecked. In reaching out more earnestly and expressing vulnerability within trusted circles, I experienced a counterweight to anxiety's pull. For example, joining a local support group introduced me to others wrestling with similar patterns. The shared stories and honest exchanges reverberated, diminishing my sense of solitary battle. Empathy transformed into strength as collective courage buoyed individual resilience. These relationships offered fresh insight and encouragement, planting seeds for bolder decision-making beyond familiar comfort zones. Through these experiences, I noticed a dynamic interaction between internal emotions and external environments. Anxiety sometimes thrives in chaotic, overstimulating contexts, magnifying uncertainty and stress. Consequently, I endeavored to curate moments of stillness amid daily life, whether through mindful breathing, solitary nature walks, or digital detoxes, to create mental space that softened tension and clarified priorities. This intentional sculpting of my surroundings shifted anxiety's influence from overwhelming to manageable, reshaping how I engaged with challenges. It proved transformative to recognize that environmental factors play a vital role in our inner balance, and gently adjusting these variables can enhance our capacity to act authentically despite unease. Ultimately, I came to view anxiety's subtle invasion not as a sign of weakness, but as an invitation to cultivate renewed awareness, resilience, and connection. Learning to discern between protective caution and limiting fear became less about rejecting one and embracing the other, and more about integrating both with kindness, wisdom, and actionable readiness. The landscape of decision-making is richer and deeper when we honor the full spectrum of internal signals, even those that whisper unease. In doing so, we reclaim the steering wheel, moving forward not in spite of anxiety's presence, but alongside it, transforming whispered hesitation into conscious, courageous choice. There was a moment during a late autumn evening when I sat by the window, watching leaves spiral slowly to the ground, their descent graceful yet inevitable. The crisp air hinted at change, yet my mind felt caught in a stagnant loop, wrestling with indecision about stepping into an unfamiliar opportunity. My hands rested tensely on the coffee cup, fingers tracing invisible patterns as a quiet unease swelled beneath the surface. It wasn't loud or urgent. Instead, it echoed like distant footsteps fading down an empty hallway, present but elusive enough not to fully grasp. I realized this sensation was reshaping my relationship with risk in ways I hadn't consciously acknowledged before. In that silence, memories volcanic in intensity but hidden beneath routine, a story of past moments where I'd shrunk away instead of embracing challenges, surfaced uninvited. Each recollection was a brushstroke painting a landscape of self-imposed boundaries artfully concealed by comfort. I questioned what made me avoid some encounters without rational cause. Was fear masquerading as wisdom? Or had comfort become a silent captor, weaving invisible chains tethering me to a life smaller than I deserved? The answer felt tangled, as if I were standing in a dense forest where every path looked familiar, yet unfamiliar, marked by shadows of past retreats and faint glimmers of boldness deferred. While walking near the shore, the rhythmic crashing of waves against rocks mirrored the oscillations in my heart, a wild, unpredictable cadence beneath the calm exterior I projected. I noticed how the ocean never hesitated. It reached for the shore repeatedly despite the relentless pushback. It struck me that living cautiously wasn't about safety, but about surrendering the fullness of experience to a fear that whispers we might break if we move too far. This metaphor stirred something raw inside. Could I withstand the crashing tides of uncertainty as the ocean does, without losing myself to the threat of fracture? What if bravery meant constant motion in spite of fragile edges? Shortly thereafter, I met with an old mentor whose words sharpened my internal compass. She challenged me. What stories do you tell yourself to justify comfort's reign? How often do you mistake safety for silence? Her question hung between us. I realized I had woven narratives where avoiding discomfort translated into maturity, an adulthood defined by caution rather than possibility. This revelation unlocked a hidden tension. Embracing vulnerability suddenly seemed less like a risk and more like a radical act of reclaiming my voice inside a world numbed by silence. My mentor's insights offered a map toward reclaiming territory lost under layers of quiet acquiescence. During a weekend workshop focused on creative expression, I observed how participants navigated uncertainty through art, each brushstroke an act of defiance against self-doubt. One woman shared she painted despite spirals of fear because it's the only way to outmaneuver it, a phrase that echoed in my bones. That night, I journaled while sitting beneath a canopy of stars, tracing patterns not with sight, but feeling, recognizing courage as a mosaic assembled from countless tiny acts, not a single grand gesture. This understanding seeped into me like morning light through blinds, shifting my perspective from paralysis toward gradual movement. Later, in a conversation with a longtime friend, I disclosed how moments when I chose safe often left me with an aching void, like a song half sung and a story half told. She listened, her expression tender, then said, "Maybe safety isn't absence of risk, but absence of growth. What if you tried discomfort as a teacher, not a threat?" This idea simmered in my thoughts, transforming fear from a prison guard into a guide, asking me to look beneath its stern facade. It reframed every choice as an opportunity to learn, not merely a challenge to endure. Reflecting on these shifting landscapes, I noticed how my body often anticipated limitation before my mind fully acknowledged it. A tightness in my chest, a slight constriction at my throat. These silent signals preceded conscious awareness that I was stepping toward withdrawal. Recognizing this somatic prelude to retreat opened a dialogue between mind and body, moving beyond judgment into curiosity. What emotions simmered under these sensations? How could I honor these messages without allowing them to dictate surrender? This newfound attentiveness became a compass, guiding me to moments where I could gently choose movement instead of recoil. On a walk through an unfamiliar city, I encountered a narrow alley shimmering under golden afternoon light. Its uncertainty invited hesitation, yet I stepped forward deliberately, sensing that this physical act was much more than exploration. It was a metaphor for stepping into my own uncharted self. Each footfall echoed with intention, a quiet rebellion against invisible barriers crafted by years of self-imposed limitation. The alley, briefly confining yet strangely liberating, became a symbol of embracing paths unknown while retaining trust in my resilience. In conversations since, I've heard others express similar stories of subtle withdrawal disguised as prudence. Recognizing this shared human pattern embedded in our nuanced choices deepens empathy and dissolves isolation. When we acknowledge the quiet dramaturgy that shapes our actions, we begin to rewrite not only personal narratives, but collective experiences of courage and limitation. This realization encourages us to step forth with openness, knowing that each small pivot toward discomfort is a declaration of life reclaimed. Now, when I face decisions where the familiar tugs at me with a comforting whisper, I pause to listen deeply, into both the pull and the push, seeking balance. I ask myself, which voice is speaking, and what might it truly be protecting? With this attentiveness, I find space to act despite trembling, to lean into unknowns while anchored in self-compassion. My journey continues not by erasing the layered currents that influence me, but by navigating them with awareness, turning whispered constraints into signposts pointing toward expansion. In a quiet moment one morning, I found myself sitting at a cafe, watching people bustle by with purposeful strides. Among them, a man stood hesitating at a street corner, glancing repeatedly at his phone as if waiting for a signal to cross. His indecision mirrored something stirring inside me, a flicker of awareness about how often I've stalled, paralyzed by an invisible tension. This hesitation wasn't just about uncertainty. It was the subtle ingrained impulse to pull back even when the path ahead was clear. I felt an urge to explore this phenomenon deeply, to understand why my instincts sometimes betray me by favoring retreat over advance. It occurred to me that these tucked-away moments of avoidance often serve as a protective script I've secretly written over years, an unconscious choreography of withdrawal masking as prudence. One afternoon, I remembered a rehearsal I once missed, not because of illness or scheduling, but due to an unspoken fear that my performance wouldn't be enough. The stage, vibrant and inviting, symbolized all I desired, yet my feet found their way out the back door. In this choice, I recognized a pattern: anxiety shrouding aspiration by conjuring scenarios where failure seemed inevitable. These fabrications, subtle yet persuasive, hold us captive in silent prisons without walls, subtly recalibrating our expectations and what we believe to be achievable. Months later, a stroll through an art gallery introduced me to sculptures with intricate details carved softly into cold stone. One piece caught my eye, a figure emerging from its base, captured mid-motion, half-formed yet infinitely alive. I saw in that frozen rise an analogy for my internal struggle, a self slowly breaking free but still tethered by unseen chains. This image helped me embrace the ambiguity of growth. Freedom doesn't always arrive fully formed. It often unfolds as a fragile dance between hesitation and courage. The sculpture reminded me that progress is rarely neat or linear. Sometimes we advance fragmented, uncertain, and still very much a work in progress. A late-night conversation with a friend revealed another facet of my experience. She pointed out that my avoidance often emanated from a misplaced sense of responsibility, a belief that withdrawing shielded not only myself, but also others from the fallout of my possible mistakes or vulnerabilities. Her insight cracked open a box I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. I had become a custodian of others' comfort at the expense of my own growth. This realization shifted the landscape of accountability. Owning decisions openly didn't just honor my journey, but modeled bravery for those around me, too. The burden of protection lifted slightly, replaced by a budding trust that being imperfect and exposed was a human way to connect, not a liability. In another moment, I encountered a workshop on improvisation where participants were encouraged to step into the unknown without scripting outcomes. Initially, my mind rebelled against the idea of relinquishing control. It felt like stepping off a cliff without a parachute. However, When asked to respond instinctively to prompts without planning, I uncovered surprising wells of creativity that anxiety had long stifled. Each spontaneous act unraveled new layers of self-expression, reminding me how often worry shackles potential by demanding certainty before action. This experience sparked a newfound willingness to invite unpredictability in small doses, cultivating an internal practice of curiosity over caution. Standing on a rooftop during sunset, I recalled a metaphor shared by a mentor, the idea of shadow swimming, immersing oneself deeply into discomfort so it no longer feels foreign or frightening. It struck me profoundly. Encountering anxiety head-on is like swimming in murky waters. Initial disorientation is expected, but staying present allows the body and mind to acclimate, to develop new strength. The metaphor shifted my approach from fleeing discomfort to embracing it as a transformative medium. It became clear that growth isn't about erasing distress, but about forging fluent movement within it. I also began to notice how sensory environments influenced these hidden currents of anxiety. Crowded spaces, abrupt noises, or even certain smells could ignite an undercurrent of vigilance that crept subtly into my behavior. Learning to curate my surroundings, finding quiet corners, wearing headphones, or deliberately pacing in nature became a powerful tool to navigate internal storms. This act of environmental tuning honored my nervous system's signals and offered a practical compass to operate more freely. The journey taught me that physical spaces can either fuel invisible pressures or become sanctuaries for rebuilding resilience. Unexpectedly, I discovered that creative writing served as a conduit for engaging the anxious mind differently. When I allowed myself to write without editing or expectation, freeing thoughts to flow even if chaotic or imperfect, it loosened unseen knots. The act of shaping words into stories mirrored navigating life's unpredictabilities, embracing messiness and honoring fragments without censure. This ritual of candid self-expression became a balm, gently restructuring mental pathways that often defaulted to defense. Through pen and paper, vulnerability transformed into a bridge from isolation to understanding. I invite you now to consider moments in your own life when you felt drawn back by an indefinable pull, when a silent whisper turned your footsteps around. Can you identify the narratives hidden beneath those pauses? Every time we peek beneath the surface, we expand the language of our inner experience, transforming anxiety from an invisible antagonist into a teacher whose lessons reveal new strength. The path forward navigates these nuanced revelations, each insight a stepping stone leading us deeper into our own authentic capacity to choose, act, and grow. Reflecting on this journey so far, I sense a subtle stirring beneath the surface of my awareness, a kind of unfolding where fragments that once felt disconnected now begin to pulse with quiet resonance. It's as if I've been tracing faint constellations across a wide, shadowed sky, each point of light modest on its own, but together weaving a tapestry rich with meaning and possibility. Within these interconnected stars lies an invitation, not to rush toward clarity as if it were a destination, but to inhabit the delicate spaces between certainty and doubt. Here, we discover a dance of presence and movement, an openness to negotiate with the whispers that have shaped so much of our experience. Walking through this inner terrain hasn't been a linear path. It's been more like navigating a river whose bends reveal unexpected depths and shifting currents. Moments of awareness surface like smooth stones beneath the water's surface, catching the light only when we pause to glimpse them with patient eyes. In these reflections, I perceive a quiet revolution, a willingness to confront the invisible architects programming countless choices, without slipping into battle or blame. There's a softness emerging in the way I approach my own story, a recognition that transformation unfolds through intimate dialogue between the parts of me that resist and the parts that yearn to explore. I recall sitting in a quiet garden as twilight settled, the scent of earth and leaves mingling with the cool breeze. Framing the sky above were branches reaching tentatively, as if hesitant, yet hopeful to touch something beyond their reach. In that moment, a profound metaphor took root in my mind. Growth as a gesture carried out in gentle increments, woven together by patience and courage. How easily we mistake the presence of quiet tension for defeat, when it's often the soil from which courage blossoms. This image lingers, urging me to hold space for the small, almost imperceptible acts that ripple beneath apparent stillness, for they are the quiet engines of change. There is an uncanny alchemy in learning to discern the nuances crowded within our thoughts and sensations, like teasing apart a complex melody composed of harmonies that at first seem discordant. Our inner landscape contains layers speaking different dialects of fear, hope, curiosity, and defense. Recognizing their interplay allows us to step beyond reflexive patterns, not to silence these voices, but to welcome them into a conversation where we hold the pen that writes each next page. It's a renewal of agency that doesn't eradicate uncertainty, but reframes how we stand within it, as co-authors of our unfolding, aware of the shadows without surrendering to them. Sometimes, moments of stillness yield the most profound clarity. I remember tracing the rim of a coffee cup with deliberate slowness during an early morning, my thoughts not racing but folding gently over themselves like soft waves lapping a quiet shore. Then came the subtle insight. Resilience doesn't demand relentless action. It asks for presence, attentiveness, and a trust that even in vulnerability, there resides a kind of strength waiting to be claimed. Within that attentive calm, the fierce grip of invisible constraints begins to loosen, offering room for the heart to stretch and steps to be taken from a place of groundedness rather than reaction. There is also a tenderness in acknowledging how external landscapes shape internal currents. The way sunlight filters through leaves, the murmur of distant voices, the rhythm of breath itself, all serve as touchstones, anchoring us to the sensate world when anxious thoughts swirl like restless ghosts. These moments remind us that though the mind may wander into the labyrinths of what-ifs, our bodies remain connected through shared rhythms, an embodied heartbeat threading continuity beneath mental storms. Embracing this connection feeds a deepened sense of belonging, not only within ourselves, but within the ever-shifting contours of life that stretch beyond our limited perspectives. As I continue to engage with this unfolding narrative, I realize it is less about arriving at an answer and more about cultivating a relationship with the questions themselves. Questions that flicker like candle flames in a dark room, inviting exploration without demanding certainty. They beckon me to listen with a spirit both curious and compassionate, to honor the tension between comfort and growth as natural companions rather than adversaries. Through this embrace, a quiet revolution simmers, a reclaiming of choice beneath the subtle influences that once guided from behind a veil. It signals a turning point where voice, courage, and vulnerability intertwine, setting the stage for a step into fuller presence. Right now, as you and I share this moment, I feel that we stand on the cusp of something vital, a threshold awaiting not a leap but a steady, grounded step forward. The threads that have wound through our reflections up to here form a delicate web, shimmering with the possibility that owning our inner landscape as it is can become the beginning of a profound emergence. This emergence holds promise not just for moving beyond limits imposed silently, but for embracing the complex tapestry of self with all its whispered contradictions. It is here, in this fertile pause, that the next chapter longs to be written, a chapter imbued with courage and grace, waiting quietly for us to begin. As I sit here reflecting, I feel a quiet stillness that's not the absence of fear or doubt, but something deeper, a subtle acknowledgement that growth often doesn't roar into our lives, but slips in softly, reshaping us from within. There's a paradox I've come to embrace. Transformation doesn't ask for the grand, fearless leaps we imagine, but unfolds through the tender surrender to uncertainty that we often resist. It's a delicate alchemy, welcoming the trembling edge of our vulnerabilities and discovering strength in motion that sometimes feels behind, slow, or unsure. This journey has taught me that courage isn't the eradication of fear. It is the art of weaving resolve through the whisperings of anxiety, creating a new fabric of experience where fear and daring coexist in a fragile balance. I recall the texture of evenings spent wrestling with invisible limitations, how the air sometimes felt heavy as if charged with an unnamed tension that tugged at my limbs and thoughts alike. Those moments, once felt as barriers, gradually transformed into teachers. Instead of forcing myself to break through with brute will, I learned to listen carefully, discerning the contours of what holds me and what beckons me forward. This shifting relationship invites a spaciousness where the edges of discomfort lose their sharpness, allowing me to move more freely within my own narrative. In this unfolding, I experience a profound shift, the realization that vulnerability and strength are not adversaries, but partners inviting me into a dance of authenticity. During quiet walks through winding streets and hidden paths, I've come to appreciate how life's most vital shifts happen outside the spotlight, away from grand declarations. Progress lives in the whispered choices, the decision to say yes to an invitation when part of me wants to withdraw, the quiet surrender to uncertainty when my mind argues for certainty, the gentle rebellion in stretching beyond habitual safety even when it's deeply uncomfortable. These everyday acts ripple outward, accumulating into a force that compels change even when the path ahead remains shadowed. In embracing this subtle revolution, I reclaim ownership over a story previously authored by fear's discreet suggestions. Recently, I found myself caught in conversation with a stranger whose eyes reflected recognition rather than judgment. Their simple words, "It's okay to be afraid and still step forward," landed like rain on dry earth. In that instant, I understood that our shared human experience contains sacred permission to feel unsettled and yet to choose movement, to have doubts and still craft meaning from them. This moment illuminated how isolation dissolves when we acknowledge that whispers of anxiety are threads woven through many lives. Knowing we are not alone transforms silent struggles into collective strength, a chorus rising gently but insistently toward healing and hope. Sometimes, I catch my breath witnessing the fragile beauty in moments of renewed engagement, sharing an idea despite internal protest, raising my voice in a supportive conversation, facing the unknown with tentative steps. These glimpses remind me that every crack in the fortress of fear allows light to fold in and reveal new facets of who I am. Fear loses its dominion not because it vanishes, but because we choose to let it coexist alongside our dreams, refusing to submit the entirety of our lives to its quiet command. Now, as I walk this evolving landscape, I invite myself, and quietly you, to hold tenderness for the parts of ourselves that hesitate, that shield, that whisper retreat. It is precisely through honoring these whispers, not silencing them, that we cultivate a fertile ground for transformation. This is a path of nuanced courage, where progress is measured not in perfection but in persistence, not in absence of anxiety, but in the audacity to move forward anyway. Life does not demand that we become unbreakable. Rather, it asks us to be willing to gather the scattered fragments of our being and piece them together with reverence and grit. Our stories, marked by quiet battles and soft victories, form a mosaic richer than polished tales of fearless conquest. Within this mosaic lies a profound truth, that choosing to show up, imperfect and trembling, is the most radical act of freedom we can offer ourselves. So here I stand, breathing into this moment, a testament to all that has been, all that is stirring, and all that awaits beyond the whispers of restriction. The invitation remains open to step forward, to inhabit our stories fully, and to walk courageously even while shadows linger. In embracing this delicate interplay, we not only reclaim the narrative but awaken the boundless capacity to live deeply, authentically, and bravely.